Basic concepts of hypothesis testing. A hypothesis is simply a conjecture about a characteristic or set of facts. Hypothesis testing is a method of statistical inference which involves making conjectures about a population based on a sample taken from the population. Statistical hypothesis tests are often used to analyze the likelihood that a population has certain characteristics. For example, we can use hypothesis testing to determine whether a prescription drug has a certain proportion of the active ingredient or whether a car part meets weight specifications. These tests are never certain, but their outcomes provide information that helps support or refute the hypothesis itself. Hypothesis testing involves determining the difference between a conjectured value of a population parameter and the parameter's estimate, which is calculated from a sample. If the difference is very large, we reject our hypothesis about the population. If the difference is very small, we do not. A result is called statistically significant if it has been predicted as unlikely to have occurred by chance alone, according to a predetermined threshold probability, the significance level. The null hypothesis, the conjecture to be tested, is given the symbol H sub 0 and always includes the possibility of equality. The alternative hypothesis is given the symbol H sub A or H sub 1. Here's an example. The null hypothesis states that mu, the population mean, is equal to 7.3. The alternative hypothesis states that mu is not equal to 7.3. If our sample mean is very different from 7.3, we would reject the null hypothesis. In other words, we would reject the null hypothesis if the sample mean is much larger or much smaller than 7.3. This situation is called a two-tailed test, a statistical test used in inference in which H sub 0, the null hypothesis, will be rejected when the value of the test statistic is either sufficiently small or sufficiently large. Consider a null hypothesis of mu is less than or equal to 7.3 and an alternative hypothesis of mu greater than 7.3. This situation is called a one-tailed test, a statistical test used in inference in which H sub A, the alternative hypothesis, is specified to be on only one side of the sampling distribution. The phrase test of significance was coined by English statistician Ronald Fisher, who lived from 1890 until 1962. In a famous example of hypothesis testing, known as the lady tasting tea example, a female colleague of Fisher claimed to be able to tell whether the tea or the milk was added first to a cup. Fisher proposed to give her 8 cups, 4 of each variety, in random order. What would be the probability of her getting whatever number she got correct simply by chance? The null hypothesis was that the lady had no such ability. The test statistic was a simple count of the number of successes the lady achieved. The critical region was the single case of 4 successes of 4 possible successes based on a conventional probability criterion. Fisher asserted that no alternative hypothesis was required. The lady correctly identified every cup, which would be considered a statistically significant result. A statistical test procedure is comparable to a criminal trial. A defendant is considered not guilty as long as his or her guilt is not proven. The prosecutor tries to prove the guilt of the defendant. The defendant is convicted only when there is enough evidence to support the charge. Here are the 2 hypotheses. The null hypothesis states that the defendant is not guilty, while the alternative hypothesis states that the defendant is guilty. The innocence hypothesis is rejected only when an error is highly unlikely, as one does not want to convict an innocent person. Let's practice developing null and alternative hypotheses. Pause the video after each question is posed to give yourself time to answer the question. Once you have decided on an answer, continue the video to check your choice. 1. A medicine is being manufactured such that each pill is supposed to have 10 milligrams of the active ingredient. What are our null and alternative hypotheses? The answer is a null hypothesis such that mu is equal to 10 and an alternative hypothesis such that mu is not equal to 10. 2. At a car manufacturing plant, there is a part that is supposed to weigh precisely 25 pounds. The engineers take a sample of the parts and want to know if they meet the weight specifications. What are our null and alternative hypotheses? The answer is a null hypothesis such that mu is equal to 25 and an alternative hypothesis such that mu is not equal to 25. 3. A survey shows that South Carolina teenagers have an average of $300 in savings. Researchers take a sample of South Carolina teens and want to know if they are representative of the overall population of South Carolina teens with regard to savings. What are our null and alternative hypotheses? The answer is a null hypothesis such that mu is equal to 300 and an alternative hypothesis such that mu is not equal to 300. In conclusion, there are many situations in everyday life where an experimental finding raises the question as to whether the finding could have occurred by chance. Hypothesis testing is a statistical procedure for determining whether chance is a feasible explanation of an experimental finding. As you continue to move through this module, you will learn the general steps for testing a hypothesis, errors that may occur, and specifically how to test both proportion and mean hypotheses.